Welcome everybody to this week's IPLD sync meeting. It's September the 6th, 2022, and as every 2 weeks we go over the stuff that people have worked on and then discuss any open agenda items, or also you can drop by and ask questions about IPLD. Let's get started with Rod.
Yeah, so I was looking over my history for the last few weeks. There's not a whole lot done. I've been sort of part-time for the past week and a half or so for health issues, but there's lots of little keeping the wheels on commits, updating repositories, keeping things going and chugging. But the biggest thing that I want to report on is where we have a bunch of issues around identity CIDs at the moment. That's being addressed from various angles, and I think this is going to be an ongoing topic for a little while. This mainly stems from some work in Filecoin, but I came back to and did some updates to GoCar. But then there's ongoing discussions about the limits of identity CIDs, and I've linked an issue in notes in the multi-hash repo. There's an issue it's a long-standing issue about, are there practical limits? Should there be limits on identity CIDs? And we're not in agreement at all about limits and about their reasonableness. Even whether it's reasonable that identity CIDs could contain additional identity CIDs. To some, that's, hey, speaking of the devil, to some that's a reasonable proposition. And anyway, so as part of that work, I found a place where I had to impose some limits, and so I came up with somewhat arbitrary limit for this particular use in Filecoin retrievals of 248 bytes maximum size, and because it mattered, in this case, a limit of a maximum of 32 links inside the identity CID, even when they contain recursive identity CIDs. Anyway, it's an interesting issue if for those that want to engage. I think the best place to do so is in that multi-hash issue. You could read through the history there. I'm trying to post updates there when, as I do things in various other parts of the stack. But I really think we're coming to a point where we're going to have to start probably not imposing in the global maximum, but at least having some sort of global standards for what are reasonable sizes for identity CIDs. And it's probably going to be use case specific, but we have too many places where they're unbounded, and that keeps on causing problems. So yeah, that's all for that. And that's all for my contribution for this week.
Thanks. Yeah, I see a hand. Mo?
So would these limits also apply to the CIDV2 conversation on like how big a CIDV2 might be?
Yeah, that's the same sort of set of issues, because CIDV2, we did start discussions in there about limits, and I really do think we need to impose something before we commit to it. And it's such a hard thing though, because you don't want to constrain people arbitrarily, and these numbers that we come up with are arbitrary. But it's these unconstrained things that we keep on running into problems with. So I think we're going to have something like a hard limit. For CIDV2, what I'm imagining is that we'll come up with a hard limit of this is the biggest that you should make, and various parts of the system will buck if you do that. And maybe we'll have global constants in our core libraries that's like max CIDV2 size or something. But then and encourage a conversation when people start to run into problems with that limit. So if that limit is not high enough for you, come and talk to us, and we'll have that conversation, and maybe we'll increase that. Whereas the reverse we're doing now is let's just leave it unbounded, and then when we run into problems, we'll have a conversation. But because it's been unbounded for so long, we just have this trouble trying to rein it in at all. So I think my preference going forward for CRDV2 is to start with a limit and then make it so that it's a conversational limit of some kind. And that's tough, but we can't be unbounded.
I also saw it from Peter.
Yeah, I had a very quick comment I wanted to make. I joined late, but on whether it is reasonable or not to have I forgot how to put it. Basically, whether it's reasonable
Recursive.
to have
Actually, I've been calling
yeah.
them. I've been calling them inception CIDs.
Right. It's not that I particularly have an feeling like, oh, this is so cool or something like that. I was more commenting that this is the natural way for a DAG to form, right? So the moment you have any kind of DAG builder, which is recursive, bottom up, your effective decision tree of is this an identity CID or not is how big is my block, right? So once you apply this recursively, you automatically just by virtue of that will end up with inception CIDs, as you call them. So it's I basically want to say the conversation that this is not something that folks are going out of their way to make. In fact, if you disable them, folks will have to go out of their way not to make them.
Except in the case, like if this comes from the fact that we are setting these limits higher than the size of a CID, because if the limit was the size of a CID, you wouldn't have that.
Precisely, yes, correct.
So sure, identity CIDs for byte ranges that are smaller than the size of a CID, I can see the reasonableness there, but pretty much everywhere where they're used, where we see this, the main use comes from the what is it called, inline builder from the CID utils for Unix FS building, and the most common value I've seen for there is 127 bytes, which you can pack a few CIDs into, and then so that sort of size would then lead to okay, well we can pack a CID in there, and the next bytes is small enough that we should pack it inside there as well. Now I understand why bigger than a CID makes sense, but it just leads to these really perverse cases where things get awkward. And in fact, this all started from the fact that this is so common in Filecoin because of the 127, where we end up with a root of a DAG that's got just two CIDs in it. So an identity CID that packs two CIDs in it. And that's the root of a DAG that's stored as the root of a card, and there's no block in the car that has that, and just chaos. Anyway, but yeah, no, you're right. This is hard, but it's we have this possibility of using identity CIDs so that we can squeeze out efficiencies. But I think, anyway, this discussion's all in that issue, I think. So.
All right. Next on my list is Mo.
Yeah. So personally, I've been working a lot on IPLD URL stuff lately, and I put together a library called JS IPLD URL Resolve, and it's kind of comparable to the link system in Go IPLD Prime, but it's in JavaScript and it's using IPLD URLs. And one of the fancy things is that it's got a concept of lenses built in. So at the moment, you can have a CID with some sort of path segments. And in the path segments, you can actually specify schemas that you want to interpret a given IPLD node as. So it will load that node and then wrap it in a schema and then continue traversing over the wrapped node. So part of this has been using Rod's recent work on JS IPLD schema, which has been really nice. So it's got validation and stuff in there and pretty error messages. So I'm pretty happy with it so far. This is probably also where ADLs will go in there when we get to figuring out what ADLs mean in the context of IPLD URLs, and also this relates to the WASM stuff that Adine worked on. So hopefully I'll get some of that WASM stuff either ported over or something similar ported over to this system. And then potentially this could mean that we have really fancy URLs linking to different data types. Yeah, so schemas are in there right now. I'm working on integrating it with the JS IPFS fetch library that I have, where I have basically different protocol handlers for IPFS related stuff like IPNS, IPFS, and PubSub, now IPLD. And I'm also going to be writing some more specs that are like now more concrete about how these parameters are supposed to be used in URLs and how the schemas should be loaded. Actually, other thing relating to schemas that I forgot to write is I brought up that it might be useful to think about schema reuse or importing schemas within schemas and how to do that. So there's been some nice conversations there. Let me link to that. Yeah, issues 243. So right now we're kind of bike shedding some new syntax potentially, or some sort of preprocessor where in your DSL, you could potentially reference a different IPLD schema file or a CID of an IPLD schema. And then that can be either resolved to a CID when we're actually compiling the DSL to the DMT using a tool or something along those lines. But this will let us have schemas which can be reused across projects, either by having people like copy paste some files around and then hope for the best on deduplication, or we could just have registries similar to schema.org of schemas that people can import by their CID. So this is still super raw. I don't think anyone, including myself or anyone, has committed to actually implementing this yet, but I wanted to get the conversation started after having worked with IPLD schemas and dynamically resolving them. It felt like a natural next step of letting other schemas reuse each other. Longer term, I've been talking to some ActivityPub and RDF related folks, and I'm trying to get them excited about IPLD and the potential to get structured data that's peer-to-peer and content addressable and linkable and all of that, mixed in with some of the existing ecosystems like ActivityPub, where they already have a lot of schemas and a lot of types of data, but most things are wrapped in servers. So I'm trying to see if we can find a bridge between the two worlds so we can reuse existing tooling and data structures and take advantage of the content addressability. This is probably going to be related to a lot of DID stuff. As well, I've been talking to the folks from Ken Labs that are working on creating a new ADL for Prolly trees, which will be useful for database search indexes. So they're kind of going off of the structure of the HAMT or the other ADLs on the IPLD website. And they're just progressing there, having an initial spec and Golang implementation. And then probably after that, they're going to work on a Rust implementation for the FVM. And so that once we have that in place, then we can have some really interesting databases and stuff ported directly to IPLD. Yeah, I think that's all I got.
Thanks. Next on my list is Will.
Sure. Just a few notes of other things happening that are a bit tangential or adjacent to IPLD. There continues to be a conversation about thinking about proofs of data inclusion around Filecoin. So is this data in a deal. And there's sort of this question of how do we want to talk about that, because the natural proof mechanism that Filecoin has, which is around a Merkle tree inclusion proof for the current proof, lets you say these bytes of data exist in a deal. But there's a disjoint or a gap between that and our current packaging in a car, because you can have the bytes that represent a block, but it's not easy to say, and this is going to be a named object that you can actually retrieve out of this deal, because that requires a non-corrupt car header, and that the striding that you do through the car with those size offset jumps all the way through the car all work out such that those bytes of data actually are properly named in the car file. So it's not just an inclusion, it's this other global property, and trying to do that global property on something that could be 32 gigs ends up being potentially quite expensive. And so that's going to be an interesting challenge for IPLD.
What do you mean by named?
Well, you've got a SID. Can you actually use the SID to reference the bytes that hash to that SID? So right now we're using SIDs, and that's one of the core IPLD things as how we talk about data. But we're going to have to think about how we match that with what we can get out of Filecoin, if we can find ways to bridge the gap of what the tools and current PCIDs give us.
Yeah,
in
and
terms of that
proofs imply content addressing too. So yeah, that's tricky.
So that was one thing. A second thing is there was noticed some selector oddness that we may at some point want to dig into. This is again going back to that ADL interpret as in selectors. It looks like when you have a union selector, so if your selector is union of matcher and of interpret as, the union actually causes you to go down one step. So the union is not, the interpret as is not executed on the direct node that you pass into that selector, but into the children of it. So if you want to run the ADL first, you have to put that above the union, which is it may be a bug in how we've got unions set up right now. It's certainly not intuitive, but there's no way to both match and ADL the top level node currently. And so that's probably something that we may need to look at, how that edge of selectors is structured. That being said, the behavior of the interpret as selector tends to mean that we don't, like, matching stops making sense. And so what did we even mean by doing a union of a matcher and an ADL is a little confusing, because at the point that we've ever used these ADLs in practice, like in data transfer, what we've cared about more is the block loading, so the substrate level blocks that are accessed, rather than the transformed node that goes back to the callback, which is not actually itself a node that exists in practice, right? And so to match this reconstructed ADL node is a little less obvious that that's what you want to do versus matching the underlying blocks that are accessed in the creation of that ADL node. The other thing, though, that we realized is not in this interpret as ADL selector space is that there's no way to ask for an ADL selector to be lazy versus non-lazy. And so in particular, if you think about a UnixFS directory that's sharded, right now that is a lazy reconstruction. And so if I interpret as and that directory, I just get the top level of it. I don't get enough to fully iterate through all of the directory entries. And if I treat it as the map of name to files that the ADL makes it as, and recurse one level, I also get the top blocks of all of the files in that directory. And so we don't have a way still to traverse just the contents of the directory. And so there's a question of, do we need some option to the ADL? Do we have two ADLs, one that is the lazy Unix FS and one that is a non-lazy Unix FS? And that may be the easiest way, is that we just have two different named ADLs there. But we should think a little bit about what our answer would be for people who want to transfer all the blocks needed to list a sharded directory, because we don't have an actual selector that would work for that right now. I think having two Unix FSs, one that's lazy and one that's non-lazy registered, is probably the easiest way there. The third thing that I figured I would mention again is that there is this IPFS camp coming up at the end of October, so in about a month. There will be a bunch of conversations. We should think about if there are IPLD conversations that are worth having there, and if so, we can advocate to make time to have those. I don't believe that there is a direct IPLD track.
Not yet,
Mog,
not
maybe
yet.
you know. I see.
There's not a track, but I'm definitely going to be doing some sort of IPLD talks. I'm still figuring out the specifics. Having a track is a lot of effort.
Yes.
I personally can't commit to that. If there's someone in the community that wants to, go for it, but we could probably just piggyback on some existing ones.
Would it be useful to have a room and then just a breakout space where we can schedule a subset of talks that we think are relevant, but then there's a space for people to talk about IPLD?
Maybe. It might be useful to also point people to where the IPFS camp discussions are happening, because I actually don't know, and I've had people asking me.
That is a great question. There, I believe, is an IPFS camp Slack. I do not know if it has fully opened yet, but the website is probably the thing that will update. And it's, I believe, 2022.ipfs.camp has the current details for the camp, which is not a ton yet, besides ticketing and some forms to apply or to propose things that you would be interested in.
Cool, thank you.
All right, thank you. Then I've added an item that news from other people from the community that I've heard about. So there is a Rust implementation that has been in the works for years. So I've talked with the author, I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, roughly. And he finally found some time to work on it again. And yeah, so just, yeah, if you're interested, check it out. The major thing there is, I would say, is it's focusing on schemas, or like this is what the author really cares about or wants to push forward, which currently is not in the libIPLD implementation in Rust. You might know, not really there. Bits are there, but not fully. So if you're interested, yeah, just check it out and give feedback. Yeah, we'll see how this goes. But we're certainly in touch. So it's really like, it's not like a so it's kind of like a friendly other development. So we certainly work together and yeah, see where it goes. And I think it's good to see also like different ideas and yeah, how this goes. All right. Is there anything else? Yeah.
I had one more item to mention that I forgot to. That so Mauve started this work on JS multi-formats, ESM upgrade, and a bunch of other things. And it's turned into an epic JS multi-formats version 10 release. So that pull request is now, so it's pull request number 199 in JS multi-formats. I'll put that in the notes. We're really close to releasing that, but we keep on coming up with these little things to tackle. So we're painting bike sheds in there a little bit, but there's a bunch of work that goes into this that will be fairly major. Once it's released, then there will probably be a bit of pain for dependencies. So there's going to be other repos that we have to update, all the codecs and lots of other utilities that use JS multi-formats. we're going to have to drop CommonJS support for this, but it does simplify things a lot, and it enables our release process to be a bit more streamlined with other release processes we have. So I'll drop that note in the notes.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to share something or has questions? No. Then I also invite everybody to the after party. So after we close this meeting, we still have some time to hang out if you want to, without a public stream in case you want to share something that shouldn't be publicly streamed, and so on. So yeah. Oh, and one more note is that so as the daylight saving time changes soon will happen, this meeting just stays on the UTC time. So wherever you are in the world, the time might change, but this meeting will be always on the UTC time. And it will make things a bit nicer for the Europeans and the Australians soon. All right. All right, then, yeah, see you all again in 2 weeks. And yeah, have a good time. Bye.